When we reviewed the RetroTINK 5X in 2021, it was a game changer for analog video upscaling. While parts of that review are still fairly relevant, RetroTINK designer McCheskey has continued to overhaul the RetroTINK 5X interface and add features like CRT masks and even the upscaling of 720p content up to 2560 by 1440. But what's even more unbelievable is that alongside all of this support for the RetroTINK 5X, Mike has also been developing the RetroTINK 4K. These are final production samples that we've got our hands on here. But not only that, we and a whole slew of retro gaming's best and brightest, people much brighter than we are, have also had their hands on pre-release boards, putting it through its paces and giving Mike feedback for many months. The result here is a product that has a very mature 1.0 firmware. That's also had the consequence of everything we'd like to do in a big RetroTINK 4K video being a moving target. I mean, Mike is a feature-making machine. And that, combined with the nearly limitless scenarios that you could test with this thing, made us realize that we couldn't cover everything completely thoroughly. So I wouldn't really think of this as a review. In this episode, we decide to focus most heavily on the HDMI input. But first up, Coury is going to give you a brief overview of a few key features and analog input. And then I'll go deeper on the pure wish fulfillment that is the HDMI input.
Since the RetroTINK 4K is constantly evolving, we decided to hold off on a full review. Instead, Tri wanted to focus on exploring what's possible when combining HDMI sources with a 4K scaler of this pedigree, because that's the big new feature that we haven't seen before. But before I set Tri loose to boggle and amaze your brains with all that, I'm going to go over some of the core features as well as give you a brief tease on how analog video is looking. Of course, the possibility of upscaling with really sharp pixels is exciting, but depending on what you're looking for, the real draw here is probably the high detail simulation of CRT scan lines, shadow masks, aperture grills, and even LCD subpixel structures that become possible when dealing with a dense 4K canvas of over 8 million pixels. The downside to this is that even if you're watching this video on YouTube at 2160p, the reality of video compression makes it very difficult to convey what these effects look like in person. So we'll be mostly showing these types of effects with off-screen camera footage or pre-zoomed capture to minimize the impact of compression artifacts. Although there is what seems like virtually limitless possibilities with the various post-processing effects, the look that we've settled on for a lot of the shots in this episode is somewhat similar to a mid-range PVM. Applying a bilinear filter to the horizontal axis and offsetting the convergence a bit can really help sell the authentic analog look. But if what you're seeing here isn't what you like, then you should know that it's all highly customizable. You can even create custom masks and load them from the SD card, which means the possibilities for different looks are nearly endless. So we can't wait to see what the community comes up with. Mike tells us that each color channel, red, green, and blue, has its own scanline generator, which is probably a big part of the reason the effects blend together so convincingly. The RetroTINK 4K also has its own black frame insertion mode, but is only possible with up to 1080p or 1440p output due to the need to run at 120 Hz. But if you have a BFI feature built into your TV, which might brand it as something like OLED Motion Pro, then you can of course use that at 4K 60 instead. Black frame insertion places black frames between frames from the source to produce a blanking effect similar to what happens in CRTs or traditional film projectors. While we can't natively show how this looks through our cameras or on YouTube, BFI makes motion appear much sharper in 60 FPS games. It also has the additional effect of making scanlines or CRT masks feel much more tangible and authentic. So we highly recommend giving BFI a try. Mike is also working with Mark from the website Blur Busters to develop features that could go beyond what your TV's BFI settings may be able to do all on its own. So with scan lines, mask effects, and black frame insertion, we've come shockingly close to replicating the benefits of CRTs on modern TVs. But in the process of doing so, we've added a lot of black to the picture, and now it's really dark. Not to worry though, because the RetroTINK 4K has HDR injection. HDR has been added in recent times to the RetroTINK 5X and the Mister, and to be honest, we haven't really played around with it very much on either of those. But on the TINK 4K at least, it's capable of pretty much completely canceling out the downsides of using BFI and CRT effects, and you have a great deal of control over how many nits of brightness you're pushing through. Now, there's almost no downside to black frame insertion, as long as the game is 60 frames per second anyway. Current implementations don't work so well for 30 FPS games. So those are the core features we thought needed an introduction before Tri goes nuts with testing stuff on the HDMI input. But I don't want to totally skip over analog input, because one of the chief strengths of the RetroTINK products has always been that they're usually inclusive for those who use composite video and unmodded consoles. There's no wrong connector choice here, and certain inputs, like SCART and the HD15, are capable of receiving a wide variety of signals themselves. The TINK's robust settings put a nearly limitless combination of effects, color correction, and scaling at your fingertips. It might be overwhelming, but fret not, because a number of collaborators like Firebrand X and Wobbling Pixels have been developing some pretty sweet profiles that should be included on the SD card at launch. These profiles are absolutely stunning, exhibiting a level of sharpness that is far beyond what many thought would be possible with analog video. But that ain't all. Defying all reasonable expectations, Mike was able to get auto-sampling working. Say goodbye to the days of needing to know what resolution a game is and choosing the relevant profile to scale it, because now a single profile can contain all possible resolutions for a console, detect when it changes, and automatically adjust accordingly. Trust me when I say that this is a real megaton for some, and might be the very thing that shows them the true potential of the TINK 4K. The old Chrono Cross problem, the dropping of signal between 240p and 480i resolution switches, was already solved back on the RetroTINK 5X and continues to be here. But auto-sampling punches that problem into the gosh darn sun, Bayonetta style. It's really incredible to see it working in real time, especially on PS1 games where all sorts of goofy stuff was happening, such as the differences in resolution between screens in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. We've been pretty impressed by the TINK 4K's handling of composite video for those who choose to use it. You can get some of the cleanest NES composite video we've ever seen when combined with these scanline and CRT mask effects. It's super authentic looking. On the Sega Genesis side, we thought it was pretty funny to see that certain filter settings even have the ability to restore dither patterns. Of course, blending the dither is exactly why composite aficionados like it so much. When it comes to 480i, currently things seem to deinterlace very similarly to what we're used to seeing with the RetroTINK 5X, although you do have some additional motion adaptive sensitivity controls. Probably the most enticing feature when it comes to 480i input is the 2-2 inverse telecine function, which will stitch together fields from interlaced games and video content running at 30 frames per second into a clean, progressive image. Depending on the consistency of the source content, the TINK may temporarily lose its lock on the fields and fall back to the normal deinterlacing methods, but it seems pretty promising so far. Videophiles will be especially interested in the 3-2 inverse telecine settings, which is great for smoothing out 24 FPS content on VHS, Laserdisc, and DVD. This still needs a bit of tweaking, but when it works, it delivers some truly awesome results. I mean, yeah, sure, it's not exactly 4K remaster quality or anything, but there's a certain look to upscaling video in this way that makes it very alluring for people like myself.
Victims, aren't we all?
Make no mistake, this is the best we've ever had it when it comes to 480i and a gaming scaler. But I'm still of a wait-and-see mindset when it comes to whether scaler technology can ever match the feel of 480i in a real CRT. And who knows, maybe the RetroTINK 4K will be the device to prove it to me as its development progresses and the community creates more profiles and custom masks. So anyway, now that I've left you with a bit of a tease on what you can expect from the analog side of the RetroTINK 4K, I'm going to hand it off to Try for a deep dive on what you can do with that HDMI input.
You've all known for a long time that plugging legacy analog equipment directly into an HD TV is not going to give you the best results. But the thing is, a lot of HDMI devices could kind of be considered legacy equipment at this point too, and their quality on 4K TVs can leave a bit to be desired. So with the RetroTINK 4K, I've been completely enamored with the ability to take digital signals up to 1080p at 60 Hz, use the controls to do some super cool things with them, and output them at up to 2160p 60 Hz. But first, I want to clear up a common misconception. Were you just now thinking, wait, 720p and 1080p can be integer scaled into 2160p, so isn't this already a solved problem? To which I'd say, well, if you have a 4K TV, take a look. You can usually improve the handling of sub-native sources by renaming your input to PC or choosing the PC icon for that input. On my LG C1 OLED, 1080p looks good enough this way, and I suppose 720p isn't all that bad either, when I'm sitting back on the couch at least. But simply put, these are soft upscales that don't take advantage of the clean 2x or 3x nearest neighbor integer scale that would in theory be possible. PS5 and Xbox Series X upscale 720p and 1080p games in a similar way. And yes, we know some Panasonic TVs from a few years ago supposedly had nearest neighbor sharp upscaling for 720p and 1080p, but Panasonic hasn't sold TVs in North America for many years. So no, this has not been a solved problem. But now we have the power to do something about it and so much more. So the most obvious thing that you might want to do with 720p and 1080p input on the RetroTINK 4K via HDMI is apply a nearest neighbor scale of games and systems that run at those resolutions. Even if it may be atypical, high-resolution pixel art games designed for 720p like PS3 and Xbox 360 games by Arc System Works really highlight how great this can look. And by the way, just so you know, what I've done here is scale the feed from the console, the left side, in a manner that's consistent with the type of upscale that these sub-native resolutions would receive on a TV. It's not a perfect method, but neither is shooting comparisons with my camera off a single model of TV either. If I switch to a view where I've done exactly that, shot the comparisons directly off my TV, I hope you'll agree that the simulation of TV scaling through direct capture is a good enough representation of how a broad range of TVs might behave relative to the RetroTINK 4K. Of course, not all PS3, Xbox 360, or Wii U games are 720p. Many may run at even lower resolutions internally. And there are many 1080p games on those systems as well. And we can't forget PS4 and Xbox One games that have no 4K support, and of course the Switch, which will become a major focus just a bit later in the video. But basically, setting your system's output resolution to 1080p or 720p to match the content, or at least as close as possible to the content's rendering resolution, is generally the best way to go about getting the best results with an upscale through something like the RetroTINK 4K. Now, does this sort of scaling work well for the typical 3D HD games of these resolutions? I would argue yes. Not everyone would agree, but I personally do not feel that the softer TV upscale makes aliasing any less visible compared to a nearest neighbor upscale. And nearest neighbor just looks cleaner and more proper for game content, I think. Maybe not in every case, but in general, I like this. However, the higher the input resolution, the lesser the perceptible benefit. My eyeballs are typically about 8 feet away from my 65-inch screen, and even with a fresh glasses prescription that I got just the other month, I can barely tell the difference between crisp nearest neighbor scaling and typical TV scaling at 1080p, and can only just see the improvement at 720p. By my guesstimation, you'd have to be sitting about 2 feet closer to really take in the difference, I think. And as pretty as scan lines may look on some 720p and 1080p content up close, like really close, I just can't see them at a distance. The only obvious thing that they bring to the table is making the picture darker, so I'd say they aren't worth it for 720p or 1080p content unless you're using the pre-scaling feature, which we'll be getting into big time shortly here. Instead of scan lines, maybe try something like a medium or coarse slot mask effect if you're particularly sensitive to things like Switch games with aggressive dynamic resolution scaling or upscaling methods like FSR. It is soft, but the HD CRT that I used to have couldn't resolve the sharpest details either, so you could think of this as sorta kinda like that. There is another function that you can do instead of scan lines though, which can look neat particularly for 720p content, the LCD filters. These sorta turn your 4K display into what looks like a native 720p screen. But just like scan lines, it makes the image pretty dark unless you can use HDR to counteract that. This also works for 1080p, but not as well as 720p, I think. Of course, I'll later also show some more examples of how these features look for lower res handheld games. Another category of systems that are easy things to try with the RetroTINK 4K's HDMI input are those that primarily output 480p. Obviously, those systems didn't originally have HDMI output, but today there are things like HDMI output adapters for the GameCube's digital output, such as the Coury, as well as mods for Xbox and Wii that simply output the same signal that the console is generating without any upscaling of their own. The DC Digital mod for Dreamcast can of course output higher resolutions, but I'd put it in this same category of 480p mod since you can also set it to output 480p and let your 4K scaler handle the 2160p conversion. I really like how 480p looks with scan lines like you'd see on a premium VGA monitor or a BVM, but sharp upscaling is pretty nice too. You can take things even further with some of the 480p class consoles to do things like removing flicker filters through homebrew software tools, like I've done here on the right-hand frame with the USB Loader GX interface for the Wii. Check out the video over on the Wobbling Pixels YouTube channel for details on how to do this. Also, while I think scan lines and masks can look great together on 240p stuff, they are a bit messy together on 480p content, I think. I'd say 480p looks better with just scan lines or just a mask. Keep in mind that while 240p, 480p, and 720p can all integer scale perfectly into 1440p, you lose that integer factor when dealing with 480p within 2160p. So if your display is compatible with 1440p like my LG C1, it could be worth experimenting to see whether 1440p or 2160p works better for 480i and 480p content. I'd expect the difference to generally be minor, but it's something to keep an eye on if you're trying to get things as perfect as possible. Since you need interpolation both vertically and horizontally to get a clean presentation if you're doing a full screen non-integer scale of 480p to 2160p, this might be a good time to talk about how bilinear shouldn't be thought of as a dirty word, and that bilinear filtering is not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on how it's used. Sharp bilinear filters allow for free-form, non-integer scaling while smoothing over any pixel unevenness and maintaining an overall very crisp appearance. This is generally what I'm referring to when I say interpolation. Softer filtering types have gotten their bad name by being widely abused as a shortcut for a retro look that isn't really authentic by itself. But when combined with scan lines and masks, that's where the magic happens, and in fact, I think you need at least some softening to make the effect work. Over the beta period, Mike has continued to add interpolation options like a cubic filter, which is a nice middle ground when the bilinear settings are either too sharp or too soft for what you're going for. These interpolation settings can pair nicely with the horizontal blur function. There's only one technique in there right now, but it attempts to reproduce certain analog characteristics, and when used with the right masks, it can help give some shaping to the sprites, even from digital sources. I kind of avoided this setting for a while since I was mostly going for PVM style looks, but I found that with a light touch it can do some real magic that's great for consumer CRT effects, the as you remember it look, if you will. There are also multiple Langschoss settings, which have an anti-ringing setting. But even with that, I'm extremely sensitive to ringing artifacts from sharpening filters, so I personally prefer bilinear sharp when going for a crisp pixel look, and one of the smoother settings when using scan lines or masks. But Mike has kept adding filters throughout the beta period, and I bet he's not done. So I have no doubt that anyone's tastes could be suited here eventually. By the way, this is a bit of an aside, but when showing scanline effects throughout this video, we're usually using color correction either in capture or in editing to approximate the perceived video levels that we see when using HDR, since we strongly recommend using HDR when using scanlines, masks, or black frame insertion. However, an actual full-fledged color correction system was implemented near the end of the beta period, so we weren't able to fully utilize it in the production of this video. But the third frame from the left here shows that it is absolutely possible to achieve a similar brightness compensation effect entirely within standard dynamic range. I have to confess to not fully understanding the color correction menu. It's way easier to just simply raise the nits, which appear in this menu when HDR is active, but this is an option if you can't use HDR or if your TV has bad HDR. I more or less just doubled the base color matrix settings to arrive at the results shown in the previous example, but since then, smarter folks polished my numbers and adapted them into a proper color preset that'll be included on the launch SD card pack as SDR scanline compensation, though you may need to adapt it further depending on what you're doing. And there are already a lot of interesting color profiles that you can load up for a variety of purposes. So yeah, 240p, 480i, and 480p obviously can benefit big time from a 4K scaler that's actually designed for game content. There are benefits for 720p and 1080p content too, but it's definitely diminishing returns depending on how close you sit to your TV. I mean, I do love the look of that nearest neighbor HD stuff, but it's hard to see the full benefits from where I sit, so I don't think the scaling of HD content alone would justify getting a 4K scaler, unless you also play retro style content output at 720p or 1080p, and then now we're talking. What has been the most fun for me to experiment with on the RetroTINK 4K, and the reason that I said the HDMI input has been pure wish fulfillment, is how it has allowed me to improve a wide range of classic game style content, whether that's through software emulation devices, FPGA emulators, HDMI modded consoles, classic game compilations, and even retro style indie games. And best of all, I've even been able to fix many games and devices that either have uneven pixel scaling and the dreaded scrolling shimmer, or improve the aesthetic of several lackluster HD remastering efforts. One thing I've been thinking about a lot is how, even though a device like the RetroTINK 4K isn't exactly cheap, I mean the price was finally announced to be $750, it still serves as a sort of equalizer for a wide range of devices and methods of play. For instance, the AVS is a wonderful and relatively affordable FPGA console that lets you play NES and Famicom carts. It even had interpolation added through firmware updates, but it's still limited to 720p output. Meanwhile, the high-def NES HDMI mod for real NES consoles, that's it right there actually, it has 1080p output, but no interpolation, meaning you either get shimmery scrolling or an inaccurate aspect ratio via integer scaling. The NT Mini Noir has 1080p output with interpolation, but it was extremely expensive and isn't available anymore. Or maybe you're sticking to more recent official products and like to play NES games on the NES Classic Edition or Nintendo Switch Online service. But with those, you've got either a noisy 720p image with shimmery scrolling on the NES Classic Edition, or a fairly clear 1080p image with interpolation on the Switch Online, but with annoying forced borders. Now, keep in mind that color palettes do vary because that's just how NES stuff is, but when I upscale these to 4K with some really darn fine CRT effects through the RetroTINK 4K, well, can you tell which is which? Maybe you can catch a glimpse of the NES Classic Edition's weird noise, or perhaps you're keen-eyed enough to notice that the interpolation characteristics differ a bit between 720p input and 1080p input. But the bottom line is, and there's the answers by the way, bottom line, none of these could look this good on their own, and here they are, standing toe-to-toe. And now let's take a look at what the source material actually looks like when bypassing the RetroTINK 4K. They vary quite a bit in resolution and proportions, so getting them to look more or less equivalent took some different settings in each case. So I guess my point with all of that is that with a 4K scaler, you don't necessarily have to keep chasing the latest mods or the latest emulation devices to keep getting better and better image quality if you're already happy with the gameplay experience and features of whatever current device you use to play the games of any given platform. It's pretty eye-opening when you see how with just one extra piece of equipment, you can get an essentially identical high-quality, minimal lag NES experience with an AVS or an NT Mini Noir when you think about the difference in age and cost between the two. So anyway, the key to this magic and the feature that I want to focus on for most of the rest of this video is the pre-scale setting. Now, doing it on HD game like I'm demonstrating here has limited practical application, but it's an easy way to show how pre-scaling throws away lines from the source, reducing the effective input resolution. This feature does exist on the RetroTINK 5X, but there, of course, you're limited to a maximum of 720p input over an analog connection. On the RetroTINK 4K, pre-scaling essentially lets you downscale the input resolution, downscaling 720p to 240p for instance, and then rescale that up to 2160p. As long as the scaling isn't completely borked at the source, it's quite easy to set up an accurate pre-scale value and rescale the image such that scan lines will line up exactly where they're supposed to. If you want to use CRT effects, the simplest pre-scale situation is if the source can output 720p or 1080p with vertical integer scaling with an accurate aspect ratio alongside horizontal interpolation if needed. For this example, let's use my Super Famicom Classic Edition and the Super NT. The former only outputs 720p, but unlike the NES Classic Edition, it does have horizontal interpolation to reduce scrolling shimmer, while the Super NT can output a really solid 1080p image, also with an accurate aspect ratio smoothed over by horizontal interpolation. So let's set each to a vertical integer scale so that it's easy to then pre-scale. For the official mini console, the default 4:3 setting gives us a 3x vertical scale with horizontal interpolation. So on the RetroTINK 4K, we'll pre-scale to 1/3 of 720p, which is of course 240p. Meanwhile, for the Super NT, we'll use a 4x vertical scale and trust that the 4:3 notch on the horizontal width is accurate enough. On the RetroTINK 4K, we'll be doing a 1/4 pre-scale to 270p. That number includes the excess black pixels above and below the 4x integer scale. From there, you'll simply turn on your favorite scanline and mask settings, and then we can also crop the image via the scaler menu, which also serves to resize it and fill the vertical space. there you have it, the Super Famicom Classic Edition and the Super NT looking essentially identical to each other, aside from the official mini-console's trademark noise anyway. You could also do the same thing with, say, the Nintendo Switch Online service, while also cropping out the borders. This principle also applies to any number of internal HDMI upscaling mods like those from PixelFX. Simply set the output to 1080p, use a 4x vertical scale, pre-scale to 270, add scan lines, resize, and be happy. In all of these examples, the interpolation from the source works in your favor, creating shimmer-free scrolling and an accurate aspect ratio. I do, however, like to add just a touch more softening to the horizontal axis on the Tink itself to really sell that CRT feel. Of course, these mods can produce some pretty convincing CRT effects of their own, but it's so cool that you can take them even further with external scaling, whether you want higher fidelity mask replications or simply sharper pixels. I'd really love to see an end to all the fussing and feuding, because look, PixelFX and RetroTINK devices can work beautifully together. It's like, if these devices can work together in peace and harmony in my own entertainment setup, then I think there's a lesson that could extend to a spirit of respect and goodwill in real life too, or something like that. At any rate, I like the idea that you can dial in your preferred CRT look and use it across devices regardless of what scanline features they may have on their own. Whether that's a modded console, mini console, FPGA console, other emulators, or modern pixel art games. That's the power of pre-scaling. Something that you may know is that the Mr. FPGA system has an interesting function to output the original resolution of each core over HDMI in a way that's not broadly compatible, but is intended for converting to analog for connecting to like a CRT for playing an authentic 240p if your particular Mr. system doesn't have native analog output. Anyway, the RetroTINK 4K is designed to accommodate this digital original resolution signal so that you can then scale it. Mike, stop adding cool stuff after I've already done my camera parts. He's done the same thing for the analog DAC, so now you can pull digital 240p from Super NT, McCheskey, and presumably also the analog Duo, which is pretty cool, but, and this is just my opinion, I'm not especially compelled to use it just because the pre-scale feature works so darned well. You can get the exact same results with native 240p output over HDMI as you could with 720p output or 1080p output fed into the RetroTINK 4K and then pre-scaled. What I like about outputting a useful HD signal from the Mr. in this way, or from any of these other devices and mods, is that you've already got a clean upscaled image from that source with no scan lines or anything that you can route elsewhere, like to a capture card, while also enjoying the RetroTINK 4K effects on your TV. Also, if this is starting to sound like a lot of work dialing in all of these settings, don't worry, because for one, I actually got pretty efficient at doing it, with some practice. But also, you can save thousands of profiles to the SD card and back them up and rename them on a computer. That's definitely an upgrade over losing your profiles every time you do a firmware update on the RetroTINK 5X. There's a folder navigation system in the profile loading menu, and you can even set a boot up profile and 12 quick select profiles that you can load with the press of a button. And I'm pretty sure that a ton of profiles will also be available on the RetroTINK wiki. So anyway, pre-scaling is great, but so far we've been looking at fairly ideal scenarios where the sources already handle the pixels properly, and all we're looking to do is add a CRT look on top of that. But of course, there are also so many different approaches to presenting retro aesthetics across different games and devices, many of those methods being quite subpar in my opinion. So, can the RetroTINK 4K help you if you need to correct the aspect ratio, or even worse, if you're presented with uneven pixel scaling? for aspect ratio correction, let's revisit the high def NES, that's the NES HDMI mod. Again, this one has no interpolation, but otherwise we've got the makings of an excellent NES experience here. So all we have to do is take the exact same pre-scaling steps we did before. 1080p output and 4x scaling on the high def NES, plus a 1/4 pre-scale on the TINK, while also setting a horizontal integer scale on the high def NES. Then we choose freeform scaling on the TINK and adjust accordingly. Now, I actually did the math here to get a bang-on spec NES aspect ratio with freeform scaling using the 1.143 dot clock rate that's typical for 256 pixel wide games. And you can do this transformation for other platforms from a square pixel aspect ratio source if you look up their dot clock rates and follow the formula on screen here. But honestly, since we're going for CRT proportions and CRTs are imprecise analog instruments, I think it's okay if you just want to eyeball the proportions. Now with no filtering, pixels may be a bit uneven, so we'll use a sharp bilinear filter to resolve this. And you can do the exact same thing with the original analog NT, which uses high def NES hardware, or the first NT Mini, as both have very similar settings and no interpolation. So yeah, it's pretty awesome that with 4K scaling, these are no longer left in the dust in terms of visual presentation. You could also squish in stuff like Genesis games, which are often presented in HD re-releases with a wider square pixel aspect ratio, such as on the Genesis mini consoles. I understand why this is done, but I personally prefer to err closer to CRT proportions. But what if your scaling is uneven or filtered in a way that you don't like, and the game or system offers no way to fix this? Stuff like that is pretty much my arch nemesis. And this is where the RetroTINK 4K's digital decimation feature comes in to save the day. What Mike calls decimation in the HDMI receiver menu is akin to pre-scaling but for the horizontal axis. And I've got to thank him for expanding the functionality based on my feedback, because I don't think he had really considered just what a powerful tool it could be for fixing presentation issues in all sorts of re-released classic games or pixel art indie games. To decimate columns of pixels from the source signal, you describe to the TINK how many pixels from the source, the input pixels, should equal a certain number of pixels in the game image, the output pixels. It takes a bit to wrap your head around it, so let's start with the simplest possible example, wherein the source pixels are already perfectly square. The GBA Consolizer is one of my most used modded systems. It scales GBA pixels so that each becomes 4 pixels tall by 4 pixels wide, and it outputs 720p. So let's say we want to add the RetroTINK's LCD subpixel effect to it. Just like when applying scan lines, we need to pre-scale so that everything will fit in place. But in the case of LCD effects, it's going to look broken unless we also define how wide each pixel is. That's where decimation comes into play. So since we know how the GBA Consolizer sizes up the image, we say 4 input pixels equals 1 output pixel. And there you have it. Pretty neat look, right? However, if you don't need the LCD effects, there wouldn't be much reason to fuss with decimation on the GBA Consolizer since it's already properly proportioned. You could, if it makes you happy, seeing the GBA's native resolution noted in the scaler menu, 240 by 160, there it is, but you certainly don't need to decimate to get the same results if you're going for unfiltered pixels. Things are more complicated, much more complicated actually, when the horizontal sizing is uneven. A good example here, I think, is the Evercade VS. This is an interesting platform for people who want to own arcade games on some form of physical media, but its video scaling prowess is quite limited, and the wide array of platforms that it emulates means that it really needs more robust video features than it actually has if its games were to be presented at their best. Luckily, things are straightforward on the vertical pre-scale front. With 1080p output, we set pixel perfect on the Evercade VS and then pre-scale to 1/4 on the RetroTINK 4K, since all of the games are based on 240p graphics, or at least all of the games I have for it are like that. However, Pixel Perfect only makes the pixels perfectly even for the vertical axis, while each individual game defines its aspect ratio, resulting in uneven horizontal pixel sizing. So how to fix this? On the Jalico Arcade collection that I have, most games seem to have a horizontal resolution of 256, but we don't necessarily need to know this to do Decimation. Taking a clean screenshot of the 1080p source and zooming in, we can identify a pattern of pixels that's 5 wide, 5 wide, and 4 wide that repeats across the screen. That's a pattern 14 pixels long that defines 3 pixels from the game. So we tell the TINK this, and then set the phase so that we're sure no columns are being skipped or sampled twice. Now, this is definitely an improvement, but the pixels will still be somewhat uneven since 14 is not a multiple of 3. We fix this simply by applying horizontal interpolation, and wow! The uneven pixel scaling is perfectly fixed! Alternatively, pixel sizing could also be fixed without interpolation by setting the horizontal sizing to an integer value after decimation, but the aspect ratio would be slightly off. I realize that the Evercade may not be that interesting to everyone, but it's just an easy example for showing an issue that is super common in emulation and pixel scaling in general. Now, I wasn't able to fix scaling issues with all of the Evercade games that I have, but I think it should be possible if Mike increases the input pixels limit, which he told us he should be able to do. However, Mike tells me that implementing the same flexibility for the vertical prescale could be a lot trickier, but he's open to looking into it, so for now we're limited to integer prescaling. For instance, I've come across a few games like the Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Ghoul Patrol collection on Switch, which unevenly scales up the Super Nintendo's active 224 lines to fill the 1080p or 720p space. And since prescaling generally requires vertical integer scaling for the pixel art, 224 isn't gonna work. So that particular example is a bust in terms of fixing its uneven scaling, at least with the currently available controls, but I've found that a strong majority of games and devices that I've tested are able to be properly prescaled on the vertical axis, and if necessary, decimated on the horizontal axis to get a really excellent result. So, let's go through a selection of pixel art indie games and HD re-releases of classic games to see what kinds of settings work for them on the RetroTINK 4K, or if prescaling works for them at all. Most of these are going to be for the Switch since I tend to buy retro type stuff for Nintendo systems, but if you have like the PlayStation or Xbox or Steam version or something else, I think in general the same settings would apply. Before we get to the games, let's set the Switch to 720p output. Finally, the RetroTINK 4K lays bare the underlying clarity of that native 720p dashboard. We won't always be using the Switch in 720p, but I want you to get used to this exercise because you'll often have to check games in both 720p and 1080p to get a proper prescale. But don't worry, as the Switch does not require you to restart the game when changing resolutions. Of course, you'll also have to sometimes check both 1080p and 720p on PC games or modern PlayStation and Xbox consoles if you want to prescale there. It's honestly not as big of a pain in the butt as you might think to find the right setting, turn on CRT effects, and get to playing. Let's kick things off with some games that aim for that classic 240p resolution. For these, you'll need your system set to 720p so that you can perform a 1/3 prescale to 240. Many of the Switch games that I have by retro developer Inti Creates work flawlessly with a 720p downscale to 240p, and in fact I've played all the way through Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 1 and 2 with my PVM style settings, and it was great. Mighty Gunvolt Burst benefits similarly from a great CRT look with a 240p prescale, as do the first two Blaster Master Zero games. But unfortunately, Inti Creates is hardly consistent with how they handle pixel art, and Blaster Master Zero 3 is not just beyond saving due to its level design and story, but also its totally wacky shimmery pixel scaling that cannot be prescaled no matter what I try. Also, let's break some bad news early here. Inti Creates Mega Man 9 and 10 are scaling disasters on Wii, PS3, and in Legacy Collection 2. This is by far my greatest disappointment when it comes to pre-scaling failures, so please post a comment if you figure out a way, perhaps with mods or future scaling features. We are huge fans of Brazilian developer Joy Masher, who's graced us with some seriously spot-on 16-bit homages with Blazing Chrome and Vengeful Guardian Moonrider. Both of these games are a totally no-fuss prescale from 720p to 240p and look gorgeous with post-processing customizations. Moon is a weird PS1 sort of anti-RPG that was re-released a few years ago in English for the first time, translated by Tim Rogers no less, and on the Switch here you have a choice of really blurry or really shimmery. I couldn't make Decimation work on the sharp visual mode, so surprisingly, the blurry mode saves the day, where the correct lines are sampled for a 240p prescale with the blur intruding only minimally, and the blur itself works well with the CRT effects. Freedom Planet is supposed to be like what a Sonic game could have been on the Saturn, and you can give it even more Saturn vibes with a pristine 240p prescale. I don't have Freedom Planet 2, but I hope I might find similar prescaling success there someday. Speaking of what Sonic might have been like on the Saturn, well, that's kind of Sonic Mania's thing. This is an interesting case study since not only does it natively support 4K with my PS4 version here, it also has possibly the best-in-class CRT filter among commercial pixel art software. But hey, if you set your console to 720p, you can prescale to 240 and do your own effects. And if this were the Switch version, you'd definitely get some nice 4K boosting. Less of a gold standard is the Sonic Origins collection. I mean, it's okay, but I couldn't find a way to prescale correctly using any resolution or in-game filtering mode, at least on the Switch. I'm guessing that this is very likely doing that non-integer 224 pixels to fill the height thing, which is not good for our purposes here. Moving on, remember how we were prescaling 1080p to 270p for 240p 4x and then sizing it up? Well, some indie devs have based their art around a screen-filling 270p, which makes for a sort of 240p plus look, if you will. This is just a little game called Metalloid Origin, and it's not bad at all actually, but the most famous game to use 270p that I've come across is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. So yeah, set your console to 1080p, do a 1/4 prescale to 270, and it's party time. Axiom Verge also prescales to 270, but some folks in the MLiG Discord reminded me that it has a few rare parts that zoom way out, so those could slightly complicate an otherwise beautiful result. So it might be better to just cut your losses and take the Sharp Pixels upscale to 4K instead, which of course doesn't require any prescale shenanigans at all. I think the coolest bunch of 270p games though comes from Tengo Project, a bunch of ex-Natsume devs who create incredible remakes/sequels of Natsume classics. These are fascinating because the games default to a wider pixel aspect ratio that intends to mimic the SNES 256 wide pixel aspect ratio, but they do so without interpolation, which is the only uncool thing about Tengo Project. However, you can force all of these to a square pixel aspect ratio through the menu, which creates a border, but you can use the TINK to smoothly interpolate that back out to the intended wider SNES style pixel width, prescaled to 270, and boy howdy, the result for Wild Guns Reloaded, Ninja Saviors, and Pocky and Rocky Reshrined is just incredible. What if there had been a generation of CRT era games designed for 360p? Would that even work? Well, pop quiz. Why do a lot of indie games target 360p? Easy. It's 2x to 720 and 3x to 1080. That's why, and it's pretty ideal for games prioritizing the Switch. So you can usually prescale these no matter which resolution the console is set at, although at times the base presentation is better in 720 versus 1080 or vice versa. Examples include Alwa's Legacy, Cadence of Hyrule, and I assume Crypt of the Necrodancer, and Alex Kidd DX. The Messenger also prescales super nicely to 360p, But while most text elements also perfectly align with the 360p scan lines, a few, like the pause text, are slightly off the grid, but remain readable and aren't a huge distraction from an otherwise excellent result. 360p isn't the only handy-dandy prescale factor shared by both 1080p and 720p. 180p is 4x to 720 and 6x to 1080. The 180p game that I just can't stop talking about is Panzer Paladin. I mean, seriously, it should be spoken of in the same breath as Shovel Knight among famous NES-inspired indie games, and it's a crime that it isn't. I mean, I like it even more than Shovel Knight myself, but speaking of which, Shovel Knight is a 270p prescale from 1080p. At first I was afraid it wouldn't work, but you have to go into the game menu and set the 1-to-1 display mode. Then you can scale up to fill the screen via the Tink itself, and it's just an excellent visual result. Now, I know you're going to ask about Scott Pilgrim, and unfortunately, things don't line up for a prescale. Hey, it was a pretty early indie pixel game, and they just hadn't learned yet. But my Switch version is unfiltered when set to 720p, which means from there you can get a nice Sharp Pixels 4K upgrade. That's a consolation prize that you'll have to take in many cases where prescaling or decimation doesn't work, and I'll gladly take it. 216p is 1/5 of 1080p, and it might seem like a weird prescale, but amazingly enough, it sort of works for Super Mario Maker 2's 8-bit and 16-bit levels. It's not super practical since the main interface is hard to use like this, and the HUD and high-res rotation effects don't quite look right even in the sprite-based levels, but it's fun to try for the novelty of it. I wish I could just keep going. I mean, this is just a fraction of what I really wanted to show, and maybe I can show more of the games I've tested sometime in the future, but that's gonna have to be enough for now. And there are more features to examine with the RetroTINK 4K in general that I just don't have time to really test out right now. I'm overwhelmed enough as it is, just showing what we already have. Now, one last thing I do want to touch on briefly here is how to integrate the RetroTINK 4K among the rest of your HDMI consoles. The reason being, people have been worried about how the RetroTINK 4K's HDMI input, which is approximately HDMI 1.4 specs, will possibly prevent them from using HDMI 2.0 or 2.1 features on 4K capable consoles. Now, something interesting I've learned while working on this is that the Monitor 2 output from an AV receiver may not telegraph the connected device's capabilities as long as that device is not powered on. That's the case with my HDMI 2.1 Denon receiver that I upgraded to, the X3800H. So, as long as the RetroTINK 4K is not turned on, systems like PS5 and Xbox Series X won't be able to see over Monitor 2 that there's a device in the chain that can't handle 4K input. They only see the HDMI 2.1 capable TV connected to Monitor 1. Now, Mike has also spent a ton of time in the beta period making sure that surround sound signals in compressed formats, as well as up to 8 channels of linear PCM sound, will pass through just fine. Now, since I'm also capturing video and don't necessarily want to always capture the RetroTINK's effects, there's another wrinkle there. I mean, the scan lines and masks are fun for my eyeballs to look at, but they aren't always going to work so well on a stream or for general recordings, right? So I'm routing things through the outputs from my AV receiver and a couple of EasyCoo HDMI 2.1 splitters, which I took out of their shells because they seem to run quite hot and I hid their nakedness and unruly wiring in this cabinet, but they work really great so far. And also, they do strip HDCP from PS3 and PSTV, by the way, which yes, you do need an HDCP stripper to feed PS3 and PSTV into the RetroTINK 4K. At any rate, with tools like these to route your signals, you can figure out a chain like I've done. maybe not as complicated as mine, but I'm sending a clean feed to my TV and to a capture card, as well as sending the same clean feed to the RetroTINK 4K, which processes it and is then split to go into another input on my TV and into another capture card. So basically, my bases are covered no matter whether I want to capture the processed or unprocessed image, and if I want to see a different or the same image on my TV. One more hookup option: before I realized that my receiver's monitor 2 output was invisible unless the connected device was on, I was actually using a two-way mechanical HDMI switcher where I was feeding the zone 2 output from the receiver into the input on this, and then one output to the TINK and the other output to nothing. So I could hide the TINK from my consoles by simply toggling the output to nothing. So just some ideas for how you might integrate the TINK 4K into your setup, since yeah, that input is only capable of up to 1080p, even if its output can be 4K 60, 1440p 120, HDR, VRR, etc. So yeah, I know you probably want to see even more, but that's just gonna have to do it for now. Huge thanks to Coury for helping cover the overview and analog stuff so that I could focus on HDMI. You know, it's funny to think about, but for a while, I was actually thinking about using scaling and OBS and various editing tricks to produce a sort of, in theory, video on what might be possible with scaling HDMI signals to 4K. But thanks to the RetroTINK 4K, I don't have to fake it. I can show you it working in real time on a product that will actually be available very soon. I wish I had the time to test even more games, and hopefully some of the ones that couldn't be improved might be saved by expanded pre-scaling and decimation settings in the future. Honestly, I'd love to revisit this stuff again someday, so let us know what games or funky use cases that you'd like to see covered, and we'll see what we can do. Wait! The RetroTINK 4K was the RetroTINK 18X all along?